Great. So again, this is Michelle Mascareñas Swan. I'm with an organization called Movement Generation, and welcome everyone to this call on moving from divestment to reinvestment. We're excited to host this along with partners and LASE, Divest Invest Individual, and a bunch of groups through the Reinvest in Our Power initiative. There are hundreds of people that have signed up for this webinar, and as Yuki mentioned earlier, we're going to be recording it, so just want to name that for folks. It will just be panelists speaking, but we are very excited to field your questions and comments, so please continue to put those into the chat box. Great. And then just so folks know, we'll go through a few speakers, we'll share some resources, and we'll also then have about 15 minutes for questions and comments at the end of the call. Yeah, and then just to start out, so I'll start off by saying that last month or the month before, there was a really powerful call on divestment in this moment, and many of us heard and learned how divestment has become a tool for really bringing together a set of what might have seemed like unlikely allies. And so we've seen how people coming together to force banks and others to divest from funding the Dakota Access Pipeline, have really understood increasingly how things like Indigenous sovereignty is not separate from climate justice, but in fact very much critical to it and linked. And then similarly, building across communities that have been impacted by the foreclosure crisis and predatory lending, with folks that are fighting mass incarceration in detention centers. And so we're seeing this rising up as really an important force that can begin to build and foster the kind of economies that we really need. So yeah, it's clear that extraction isn't just about fossil fuel extraction, and it's also clear that we're in this moment of transition, and who leads it, and who leads it will determine how it goes and where it ends up. And so what we're seeing is increasingly folks understand that transition isn't just about an energy transition. It's not just about fossil fuels moving to renewables, but it's really about shifting economy as a whole and who controls the economy or economies themselves. So next. So so I'm going to share a little bit a framework for a just transition that helps us understand how we need to move from an extractive economy towards living or regenerative economies. Next slide. And the root of the word economy just means really management of home. So not to complicate it too much in the way that we think of it as GDP and all of these things, but really understanding it as management of home. Go ahead. And any economy has some core pillars. You take resources combined with labor or work and apply it towards some purpose. That has to be rooted in a worldview, a culture and cosmology that makes it all make sense, and then coordinated through some form of governance. In the extractive economy, what we see is that resources are resources, and that's not a great word, but really the living world around us is gathered together through a process of extraction. It's really a dig, burn, dump cycle. Labor is extracted through a form of exploitation towards a purpose of increasing concentration and control of wealth that is used and is wielded as power. And that is all connected through a worldview of, individualism, of white supremacy, patriarchy, consumerism, and the sense of, wide frontiers that are just open for continued mining and profit and expansion. The governances, of course, those in power are those that control the wealth, and militarism is a constant force that's used in this economy. People won't give up their lands and their livelihoods, their cultures and traditions without a fight. And this is what we see every day. And it's clear, it's why we're on this call, that we can't stay within that extractive economy. We must move towards living economies or regenerative economies, where the purpose is towards ecological and social well-being. And that requires that we organize economy in whole new ways, where the living world around us is we're working with the living world around us through regenerative processes and cycles, and applying our labor in cooperative ways that are mutually beneficial for the human bodies and communities that are part of those places that they depend on, and and to each other. That has to be rooted in a very different worldview, one in which sacredness and caring are really at the root. And then governance must be new forms of new and old forms, really, of deep democracy. So learning from human traditions through the ages of mutual aid, but also really embodying agency, the agency that each of us brings to our labor, to the way we love and care for each other, that those are critical. That's a critical piece of fostering living and regenerative economies that that meet ecological and social needs. So how do we get there? I'm going to share just a couple of like the core strategies we think, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but this Just Transition Strategy Framework has been developed through conversations and the work of many hundreds, probably, of grassroots organizations across the country, many of whom are involved in the Climate Justice Alliance and the Our Power campaign. And this is a framework that we're using to help to guide the strategies of shifting and building and fostering a just transition. So first and foremost, we have to build what we need. We have to build visionary and oppositional economy. And that means really asserting our right to apply our labor in ways that meet our needs in every sector of the economy, right? In transit, in energy, in food, in waste, in care work, in art and culture, etc. And this is a really critical piece of the transition, because what the hands do, the heart learns. And our movements have been for too long focused almost entirely on fighting and resisting the systems that are bearing down on our bodies and our lives every day. And then in sort of separating the process of how we build the new. And this is a moment in which we're seeing increasingly movements bringing those together and really building visionary and oppositional economies that can stand up to and actually draw from this extractive economy, draw our labor and our love out of those economies and put them towards what we really need. Next slide. Second critical piece of this is to restore the wealth that has been taken out of the living world and enclosed into the chain of the market, and restore it into the hands of the communities that that depend on those places. And so restoring wealth to the living economy is crucial. If you could flip to the next one, see a little bit closer. That means we have to starve and stop and divest from the extractive economy and move that directly into regenerative economies that are community controlled. We have to invest in our power, people power, community power, and feed and grow those economies in the process. You can flip to the next. In all of this, our movements must be increasingly wielding the economic power that we are building as political power, and actually in doing so, changing the rules. That means devolving increasingly money and power from where it's currently concentrated and controlled. You can go to the next slide. down increasingly to the local levels, where communities must be in direct control and democratically governing that. Next slide. And I think I'm done. Yeah. So yeah, it's clear that we have to move these resources to the control of frontline communities to build these new forms of economy, or else the cycle will just continue. We need reinvestment towards whole systems of reparations. And this call, the next couple speakers will share different ways that we can especially drive capital out of the extractive economy towards regeneration. And I want to just share a framework of, thinking about that as both friendly capital, like where is there capital that is ready to move, people who understand, who have wealth, or institutions that are in control of wealth and are increasingly understanding the necessity to repair relations and restore capital to regenerative economy. And so that's one set. And the other is contested capital, those places where capital is currently controlled, where our movements must contest for our right to govern over that wealth. And so we'll have speakers to talk about both. And with that, yeah, I want to introduce our first speaker. So Jamie Trinkle is here today. I'm really excited to have you, Jamie, from Enlace and also Freedom Cities. Enlace is one of the founders of the Freedom Cities initiative, and Jamie's going to share with us organizing strategies and victories from the recent work that they've been engaged in. Thanks, Jamie.
Hey, thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. My name is Jamie Trinkle. I'm the Senior Campaign and Research Coordinator with Enlace. Enlace is an international alliance that's developed an integrated organizing approach to build strong organizations and strategic campaigns that can win self-determination for oppressed communities. So as part of that work, we're the convener of the Prison Divestment Campaign and the Freedom Cities movement. We launched the Prison Divestment Campaign in 2011, recognizing that criminalization of people of color and immigrants is definitely a tool of oppression, but it's also a giant obstacle to low-wage worker organizing for a just future. So we've been working within the Prison Divestment Campaign to break the lobbying power of the private prison industry with the aim of abolishing this for-profit industry, as well as the entire prison and immigration enforcement, detention, deportation systems. In the Prison Divestment Campaign, we've achieved big wins for reinvestment at the institutional level in the last year. And so I want to share a few stories with you all about what reinvestment has looked like at universities and cities. So next slide, please. So at the university level, I want to share victories from our partners, the African Black Coalition, who have won enormous victories in the public university systems in California. The African Black Coalition is the alliance of all the African student unions and Black student unions on the University of California, California State University, and growing into the community college system. So they're powerful organizing from 2013 and 2014 led in June 2015 to the university actually, December 2015, the university stopping all direct investments in private prisons. They were then able to build on that and push the university to stop investing in major private prison lender and investor Wells Fargo. And so after winning prison divestment at California State Los Angeles, they actually won reinvestment in Black scholars living learning community, in cross-cultural centers for Black and other students of color, and significant contributions on a yearly basis that will have to be reapplied for, but to recruit and retain Black students. These efforts are continuing at UCs, led by Black student unions. So at the The Black Student Union UC Berkeley just won recently funding for the Fannie Lou Hamer Resource Center for Black students. There's ongoing efforts to win reinvestment in infrastructure and social support for Black students at the rest of the UC systems. So that's some really incredible work that's happening at universities for direct reinvestment in students who are coming from communities who have had wealth extracted from their communities, as well as profiting off of the caging of their loved ones and their community members. And I want to share now about our city victory in Portland. In Portland, we won a monumental victory last month after a 3-year campaign where we originally asked the city to just stop investing in banks like Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase, who are major investors in private prisons. We actually pushed the city to stop investing in all corporations. And that has opened the door for city commissioners and organizers to explore creating a municipal bank later this year. City commissioners have actually committed to do a feasibility study to create a municipal bank. And our Portland victory is a milestone of what we can accomplish through deeply intersectional organizing. And it pushes us to imagine how we can build a movement that will provide all of our communities with the resources that they need to thrive. In our Portland campaign, we built Black and Brown unity and cross-sector movements. We brought together prison divestment with no DAPL, with fossil fuel divestment, with the Palestinian human rights efforts of the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement. And we worked together without throwing anyone under the bus to push for divestment from all corporations that are complicit in criminalization and the destruction of Indigenous communities and communities of color. So Portland City Council vote was the result of diverse communities standing together demanding that the city make all of our communities safer by pulling its money from systems that harm us and disproportionately harm communities of color and immigrants. The vote in April signals that we are actually building the community control together over our cities that will make our communities safer. Next slide, please. So for that reason, the Portland divestment victory and accompanying promise from City Council to look into creating a municipal bank are milestones in the Freedom Cities movement. Are a true embodiment of what community control looks like, and it's a testament to our political power and our need to build more political power. I think our organizing strategy in Portland really provides a template for other communities on how to challenge oppressive institutions while offering alternatives and while building the movement locally for a just transition. So we unequivocally in Freedom Cities and in Portland demand safety for immigrants, for all people of color, for women, for queer and trans people, for gender nonconforming people, for Muslims, for people with disabilities, for people with criminal convictions, and for all oppressed people. So Freedom Cities is an 8-point platform that was created by multiracial and multi-sector workers in New York City who envision how our cities can be sites of building alternatives, of community control and investing in humanity. We have a lot of amazing other speakers, so if you want to learn more, I'm happy to answer that in the Q&A, and also point you to freedomcities.org and also to enlaceintl.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. That was great. So inspiring. And with that, we're going to move to Vanessa Green from Divest and Invest Individual. And Vanessa's going to move us kind of from the institutional campaigns and victories to the individual victories and strategies to move your investments and money to places that are not doing these horrific things. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everybody for being here with us today. So, as Michelle said, I work with the Divest and Invest initiative, and there's several, as you all probably know, pockets of work happening out there in the world around divestment and investment as we move away from fossil fuels and toward a cleaner and more equitable energy economy. So I do work with the individual campaign within this movement, and this first slide is really just to acknowledge the global reach and the impact that we all collectively are having. And so as it says here, in just about 3 years, we've really exploded this movement metric. That's sort of our value add here, I think, where we've invited people and institutions to pledge to move their endowments or their money and investments, and kind of report how much assets under management that is worth. And as we accumulate a aggregate total, we've reported that out annually, so that policymakers, particularly folks involved with UN decision making, could see that metric grow. That sort of represents a fossil-free economy. And so next slide, please. You can see some of the latest numbers that were reported in December of 2016. Currently, you can find this graphic on gofossilfree.org/commitments. It's a 350.org website. So it's really great. We've reached 5 trillion and counting. It's greater than that now, but this was, as I said, as of December. You can see that there's over 700 institutions that have made commitments. And that's anything from full fossil fuel divestment to partial. And then we have 58,000 individuals committed. It's more than that, and about $5.2 billion are being moved within the sort of individual camp. You can see the rest of the breakdown there. So there's been lots of news about this in sort of very visible outlets. So it's, we're really excited, I think, to say that this is still the tip of the iceberg. And so next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, and I should have said, if you have not pledged yet as an individual or an institution, you can go to wedivestinvest.org to pledge and be counted. So this slide is, just to kind of help fill in the gap. 58,000 individuals pledging is something great. There's so many more people out there, as you all know. And so one of the ways that we hadn't really been able to engage people prior to the last 6 months or so was around bank accounts. And many people hold bank accounts in addition to investments, but a lot of people just hold bank accounts, and wanting to play the role that they can play that is so crucial in this movement, shifting money. So there was a joint petition that went out in support of the No DAPL, Defund DAPL efforts that were picking up a lot of steam and global attention last year. And several organizations, including Divest Invest Individual, put out this petition and worked with Indigenous leaders at Sacred Stone Camp and the Indigenous Coalition there, along with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, to get input and direction on that petition. You see 709,000, it was more than that, but that was at the point that we kind of announced it, signed that petition. It called on banks financing the Dakota Access Pipeline to stop their financing until all issues had been resolved to the desires of the tribe and other elders. So that, all that led to was a whole lot of protests at bank headquarters. It led to personal divestment. And you can see there's a woman there with, celebrating her divestment on social media, which we encourage. And you can see in the Financial Times, there was an article, highlighting the pressure that banks are under. And so that there's a collective effort around Defund DAPL, right? But the people power and the consumer power and the threat of moving money if banks don't kind of put their practices in alignment with our values was very clearly there. Next slide, please. And so real quickly, I'll just say, at the top there, consumer and investor pressure really generate reputational and material risk. And then that leads to policy change and accountability measures. And people have a big role to play in that by voting with their dollars, right? And so you can see the timeline from the end of last year. There were banks that were selling off their DAPL loan shares, banks that sold off their shares in sponsored companies, and closing credit lines. And then we had US Bank come out just last week saying that they were going to stop funding pipelines. So they haven't totally done that, don't be fooled. But we're really looking for more people to be involved in this kind of thing, because we're gonna see rapid progress. And I just highlight there at the bottom that one of the big asks on all this that keeps this, Indigenous and other communities that have been on the front lines of the fossil fuel extractive industry for a long time is this notion of free, prior, and informed consent, as stated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I encourage folks to look into that. Next slide. And just super quickly to say, there's another petition that's engaging people. It's beyond DAPL. It's DAPL plus other tar sands pipelines that are currently being proposed and seeking financing. So please look on social media for links to that. And we're looking to kind of get to 1 million people by the end of the month. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. Right on. So we're moving now towards a couple of speakers who are going to share with us some sort of concrete places and efforts of building democratic economic power through new institutions or different kinds of institutions. So we're going to start that section with Marnie Thompson, who is with the Fund for Democratic Communities and also the Southern Reparations Loan Fund. And Marnie's going to share with us some a framework really of non-extractive finance and also a financial commons. Thanks, Marnie.
Thanks. Next slide, please. I want to ground my presentation by opening with a set of slides that depict the Renaissance Community Co-op story, and that is based in my hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina. So in 1998, the Winn-Dixie on Phillips Avenue closed its doors, even though it was profitable. And the closure of that grocery store in this area led to this area becoming a food desert. And that was something that had happened in thousands of communities in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, all across the country, in both urban and rural areas. And what this meant was that not only could the 35,000 people who lived in this part of town not have easy access to fresh, affordable food, but it also led to economic decline and blight that discouraged the whole neighborhood in lots of other ways as well. Next slide, please. This is what that shopping center looked like in 2016 as a result of the closure 18 years earlier by the Winn-Dixie. Next slide. And this is what it looks like today. In October of 2016, the Renaissance Community Co-op grocery store opened. It took 5 years of community organizing and political struggle, business planning and fundraising, but it all came together last year. The store has more than 1,200 community owners and 20 workers, and it is now selling food to everybody in the neighborhood. The store is 100% owned and controlled by this very community, one household, one share, one vote. So it is never going to pick up and leave to go get a higher return on investment elsewhere. Its whole purpose for being is to serve this neighborhood. And non-extractive financing from the Southern Reparations Loan Fund played a really critical part in making this all possible. The Renaissance Community Co-op is just one example of the thousands of community-owned enterprises that are essential to building a new economy that is more democratic, just, and sustainable. And I wanted to start with this very tangible example because it's easy to get lost in the abstractions about finance capital, but even though it's easy to get lost in it, we really have to dive in and really understand finance capital. We have to get our minds around it. So let's have the next slide. So there's this core dilemma that communities that are recovering from extraction, they require finance capital to start and grow community and worker-owned enterprises that meet people's needs. And so the question is, how do we make that capital available so that we don't reproduce the extractive economy that screwed things up in the first place? Next slide, please. So the financial cooperative is a decentralized national infrastructure for cooperative lending and non-extractive finance that we think is the solution to that dilemma. It makes finance capital available to communities that need it the most at terms that strengthen the businesses and their communities. Next slide. The financial cooperative is itself a cooperative. It's made up of democratically controlled, place-based loan funds from around the country that all subscribe to 5 core principles: productive sustainability, democratic decision-making and ownership, radical inclusion that centers historically marginalized communities, maximizing community benefit, and non-extraction. And we don't have time to dive into all of these, but I do want to talk about the first and the last. Productive sustainability means 2 things. It means that we lend to projects that are designed to become financially self-sustaining. That is, that they're not going to need grants and donations to continue. And the second thing it means is that their sustainability stems from the fact that they make a productive contribution to the real economy of meeting people's needs, not this economy that we're living in that dominates right now, which is the financialization of everything that contributes no actual value to society. The last principle, non-extraction, has to do with the terms under which loans are made. And my way of thinking about this is that the borrowing community should never be made worse off for having borrowed the money in a non-extractive loan. And this, even if the venture fails, the borrowing community should not be hurt for having made the decision to borrow money. They may not get what they want if the business fails, but at least they won't be worse off. Non-extraction as a principle translates to a lot of details about the interest rates, profit sharing, and how long borrowers have to repay. And that varies a lot loan to loan, but the basic principle is there for non-extraction. Next slide, please. And at this point, there's more than a dozen loan funds around the country that are in various stages of participation in the financial cooperative. And you can see a list of them on the slide. You'll have to actually download this and read them because it's small print, I know. I'm going to name a few of them. The Working World is the oldest and largest of the loan funds, and they provide a lot of the backbone services to the rest of them because they've been around a while and have the capacity to do so. The Baltimore Roundtable on Economic Democracy, otherwise known as BRED, which I think is the coolest name ever. There's Arroyo Seco in Los Angeles, and Cooperation Richmond in Richmond, California, and Michelle also on this webinar is connected to that one. And the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, and I'm a founding member of the Southern Reparations Loan Fund. And it is a little different from the other ones because it covers a very wide area in the US South. Next slide, please. These member loan funds employ the power of aggregation to help them achieve their goals more effectively and efficiently. And they do that by sharing three things. They share learning, and the way they do that is by a peer network of other loan funds that are sharing everything they're learning about every step in the process of becoming a loan fund, vetting potential investments, supporting those projects so that they are successful and the investments get paid back, and so on. We also share back-end services like bookkeeping and regulatory filings and nonprofit status and things like that. And we share capital. Let me see. And this power of aggregation, oh, next slide. These are pictures from last year's annual meeting of the member loan funds that has, for the last 2 years, taken place at the Watershed Center. And just gives you some of the idea, some picture of the peer learning that is going on as people develop these skills around lending, investing, and business development from a social justice framework. I want to say also that the power of aggregation also makes it possible for investors to invest with lower risk and greater impact. With this many loan funds seeking out and supporting community-based ventures, we can be sure that investors' funds can be put right to work right away. For example, right now, we may not have an investable project in the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, but an investor may be ready to move some money, and I guarantee you that across all the loan funds in the financial cooperative, there's going to be a place to put that money to work right away. And this also helps the whole loan fund and the investors deal with risk better, because with more loan funds and more enterprises in the portfolio, all from different parts of the different sectors of the economy, with more geographies involved, risk is spread out over a more diversified pool of projects rather than piled into a small number of more vulnerable projects. Next slide, please. So I want to say this, that the people who are developing the financial cooperative, there's many of us, and we are all struggling a bit with what to call this new infrastructure that we're creating. And there's this word "the" at the start of the phrase financial cooperative. And sometimes that makes it sound like it's a unitary thing, and it makes it sound like we're just another loan fund that wants your money. But we think we're so special, we call ourselves the financial cooperative. And I think that's a misreading. I just want to say that the big audacious idea I want you to understand is that we have to build fresh infrastructure that is purpose-built based on values. And what this project is really about is growing a decentralized, democratic, and place-based infrastructure that puts the people's capital under the ownership and control of the people. And what I mean by the people's capital is the piles of money built up through stolen lives, land, and labor of working people across generations and continents. If this project works, and I think it will, We're talking about building a democratically controlled financial commons that will include hundreds, if not thousands, of loan funds and banking institutions that are all playing by the people's rules rather than Wall Street's rules. I'm done.
Right on. Love it. The people's rules, yeah. Great, thank you, Marnie. So our next speaker is going to move us into the arena of banking and credit unions. Day Del Rio is with the New Economy Project in New York City and also the board chair of the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union. And maybe before you start, Day, since we're getting a lot of chat about the slides, just want to name that we are, as the panelists, going to figure out how to best share the slides that we can with you afterwards, and we'll have also the recording, which will show the slides, I believe, and we'll also have links and resources. So you can rest assured that you will get some more resources after the call. And with that, we'll move to Day. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and hi everybody. I'm the co-director of New Economy Project, which is an economic justice organization in New York City. We work with community groups and civil rights and labor and other allies throughout the city and beyond to challenge Wall Street banks that strip wealth from communities, to expose the extractive nature of our current financial system, as Marnie just really brilliantly described, and really to show how banks in their current form in our financial industry have served to fuel inequality and poverty. So that's kind of the oppositional part of our work. On the kind of visionary building side, we also work with grassroots groups in communities of color throughout New York City to help them create cooperative, community-led institutions like worker co-ops, as well as community land trusts that can take land and housing out of the private speculative market, and many other campaigns. We're also trying to bring together all of these organizations and coalitions in New York City to fight for a municipal bank so that we can have our city's deposits, our public deposits, our municipal deposits put into an institution that allows the city to kind of rest away, pull away a little bit from Wall Street banks, which right now also have our cities and our governments captive to their services, and also so that our governments can use a public bank to invest in the real economy and in real community needs that are not being met by the mainstream financial system. And then I'm also, like most people on this call, wearing a few different hats. The second hat is as board chair of the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, which really needs to get a new name because we, while this credit union started in the Lower East Side of Manhattan 30 years ago, it's now serving lower income people, low income New Yorkers, immigrants, and others citywide. And we do have several target neighborhoods that we focus on serving as a community development credit union. So if we can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I want to do in this short time is to kind of help folks understand the full landscape of credit unions, because I think sometimes there's a real shorthand about moving your money to credit unions, like they're all just wonderful, beautiful, cooperative entities, and they're really not all the same. And it's really important, I think, for us to know that if we're trying to figure out where we can put money and capital where it'll have a real impact. So just looking here, so what I want to do with this kind of a couple of slides that I'm showing is just bring people into some New York City neighborhoods for a moment. I know folks who are dialing in from all over the country, but so what you're looking at right now is a neighborhood, East Harlem, El Barrio in Upper Manhattan. It's a community that is very heavily influenced by Puerto Rican and Latino culture. It's a very densely populated community. More than 100,000 people live there, and you can see here the kinds of financial services that people have access to in their neighborhood. A sprinkling of a couple of bank branches, but really far outnumbered by pawn shops and check cashers and other services that are providing very limited services. This is one of the neighborhoods that the Lower East Side People's Credit Union serves. You can see the little green star towards the bottom. If you can go to the next slide. So scooting down, what you're looking at now is the Upper East Side of Manhattan, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, which is actually just a few blocks away from the neighborhood you just saw of East Harlem. And you can see here that you have a huge, sort of explosion of bank branches. This is one of those neighborhoods where people complain, there's too many banking services, get these out of my community. So we can keep going. And, that pattern is something that plays out throughout New York City, low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, and neighborhoods across the country. So what you're looking at here is New York City as a whole, and where you see lots of white spaces, you know, these are all neighborhoods where there's fewer than one bank branch to serve every 10,000 people in that community. It's really the void of bank branches is what you're looking at here. And if we had more time, I could show you lending maps to show that there are no loans being made by banks in these same communities. I could show you subprime lending maps where you would see an explosion of loans being made in those communities that banks are not serving, foreclosure maps and other types of extraction that, you know, that are not just about individuals being preyed upon, but really the extraction of billions of dollars of wealth from communities and people every single year through a variety of products and tactics that these companies have really perfected. So this is the context in which my credit union is working, and I want to sort of use that to explain my credit union as a community development credit union versus the broader credit union landscape. So I think if folks on the call know that all credit unions share certain characteristics, being not-for-profit, member-owned, so they're cooperatives themselves, and governed by a board of directors that are made up of members of the credit union. Credit unions are also regulated by state or federal agencies. Deposits are insured in credit unions. So these are things that apply across the board, to be totally clear. But like all kinds of cooperatives, right, they can be cooperative in name or they can be cooperative in mission. And I think what sets apart the community development credit unions is sort of their focus on neighborhoods. So looking at place and trying to meet the needs of communities that have been long redlined by mainstream banks, that are targeted by predatory and other extractive loans, and thinking not just about their members, but about the community as a whole. What are the affordable housing needs, the small business needs in these communities? How can our institutions collaborate with worker co-ops and community land trusts and others that are sharing this mission of trying to put economic control back in the hands of people that have been left out or really deeply harmed by our current economy? And so our credit union really sees ourselves as an antidote to some of this predatory lending and extraction. One of the kinds of things that, you know, to give you a few examples, my credit union makes loans to what are called low-income limited equity housing co-ops. Some of the few remaining forms of affordable home ownership in New York City, it's cooperative home ownership, where people can buy their apartments sometimes for a few $1,000s and cooperatively manage their buildings. There are limits on income, and there's deep limits on how people can resell and at what profit. And so because of that, these are kinds of investments that mainstream banks are not very interested in at all. And we're, you know, preserving deeply affordable housing as shelter for people through that form. We can move on. So what are the, you know, this is just an illustration of some of the kinds of financial services that are flooding these communities. You know, check cashers, rent-to-own stores, payday lending in many communities, although we've been able to keep this out of New York, fortunately. If we can move on to the next slide. Oh, so there are a couple slides here. I know folks have been asking for these comments, and so I'm sorry, for these slides, and so I will definitely welcome people to check out our website, neweconomynyc.org, for these kinds of for these slides and others. This comes out of a kind of a popular education tool that we created that is breaking down how banks contribute to inequality and harm communities, and then also what can we do about it. So this slide is kind of, I won't go into it, but it's, you know, how is our financial system supposed to work? We're supposed to have banks and lenders, you know, financing and helping support a real economy. And if we go into the next slide, you know, it doesn't work that way, right? So how it really works is, again, extraction, there's redlining of communities, and there's also the big banks kind of fueling a lot of predatory and seemingly fringe services that are really just feeding back into the big banks. If we can move on. A new economy is possible. So this is, I don't know if folks can read this, but basically it's to emphasize that for us, community development credit unions, cooperative loan funds like the one Marnie described, and other forms of cooperative and community-controlled finance are part of a bigger system. They are the kinds of financial models that we can build on, that we can expand to serve the kinds, you know, to create the kind of economy we want and the kind of institutions that we want. If we can skip ahead, I know I'm running very short on time. Just a couple of really quick takeaways. So again, not all credit unions are the same. If you want to find a community development credit union, a good place to start is the website I listed there, cdcu.coop. It's an umbrella organization for these kinds of institutions. I would say also to just pay attention to some of the advocacy positions that credit unions are taking. In addition to not necessarily being focused on serving low-income people or communities, many credit unions actually take pretty rabidly anti-consumer, anti-government regulation stances. And so you want to make sure, you know, if that's one of your values, you probably don't want to put your money into one of those kinds of institutions. The other piece I wanted to mention is, and maybe we can get into this more in the conversation, but when you're thinking about moving your money, to think beyond deposit accounts, savings, and checking, and how can you move loans and credit cards, and in other ways bolster and really strengthen these kinds of institutions. And then just the last point is that if folks can please, when you move your money to a credit union or wherever it is, try to engage and be involved, because that is what makes it a cooperative. So getting involved through boards and committees, forming partnerships, and making sure that these institutions are really contributing to the kinds of needs that you or your organizations or your coalitions have identified in the community. So thanks so much, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Day. Yeah, Vanessa, do you want to jump in with resources?
Yeah, thank you. So just with respect to leaving enough time for Q&A, I'm just going to very quickly say that there's a smattering of resources out there to figure out where you're sort of setting your limits in alignment with your values, if you're going fossil free or if you're going further. And so if we can have the slides back up. Are they there and I'm not seeing them? Thanks, Yuki. So yes, there's a lot out there. Don't get overwhelmed. There's a lot of good tools. And so in the top left corner of this, you see Divest Invest Guide. That's a project of Divest Invest Individual that is seeking to really be a clearinghouse of good tools and resources. It's always a work in progress. So I'm excited to share with folks what's there today and have that be different, you know, in 2 months, 3 months, et cetera. And so next slide, please. This is a lot of information. There's resources in there about bank switching and sort of the steps that you could expect, and then a checklist for questions that you may want to ask when you're engaging with new banks and figuring out where you want to end up, banks or credit unions or another financial institution. This page is actually available in a new Divest Your Personal Finances Toolkit, which you can get at divestinvestguide.org. So I think I'll leave it at that and go to the last slide. Yep, there it is. And again, if you would like to pledge and be counted and help us grow those numbers, I'll just say divestinvest.org is where you do that. And just to leave everybody with this thought that, you know, there's 5 trillion and counting that are sort of quantifying this fossil-free economy, and there's really a lot more to the shift that we've heard this whole webinar about today. And, you know, it really doesn't take too much money out of that 5 trillion to really shift dramatically what's going on in local communities.
Great, thanks Vanessa for those. And there'll be other resources too that we'll be sharing after this call again. And with that, we're gonna move into the Q&A portion of our conversation today, which we all apologize that it feels a little more one way than I know we would like to be having with you all. So we're excited to have your names and have folks participating in the chat space. And you know, we can be in touch afterwards for sure as well. But I wanted to start it off with this question for Jamie, actually, about Freedom Cities. Folks are wanting to know a little bit more about the initiative and how it can be used to promote new finance strategies for cities.
Yeah, thank you. So Freedom Cities, as I said earlier, it's a vision that came from workers who are most at the will of this extractive economy, based off of the work that they do and their identities, and how their communities are under attack. And so these folks realize that we are not living single issue lives. And so they've developed a movement platform. It's 8 points around ending criminalization, investing in people and planet, political power and community control, economic justice and workers' rights, gender justice, community defense and community self-defense.
One of the for-profit capitalist processes we have used since the beginning of time. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, Marnie.
Let me unmute. Am I?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, okay. I don't know anybody who can help you create that, but I saw somebody had posted some info about AFSC. I have a comment I want to make about a values-based stock index. When you buy a share of stock, you're buying a share of ownership in that company. And this whole question of ownership, and that's not the only way you can make investment in the new economy by buying stock shares, by the way, but I just want to talk about what it means to own a share of stock. It means you own a share of that company. And this question of ownership is right at the very core of all the work that I'm connected to, whether it's at the Fund for Democratic Communities, Southern Reparations Loan Fund, the Financial Cooperative, Reinvest in Our Power. And so I'm not sure in the new economy that we're heading towards that kind of stock ownership by disinterested people who are not in the immediate community that's being served by a particular enterprise will actually make sense anymore. But we're not there yet. And there are certainly companies that are offered on various public stock exchanges that are the kind, we like those companies more than some other companies. So we're in a transitional time right now, but I just want people to be aware of what it means to own a share of stock. The financial cooperative isn't offering itself in terms of shares of ownership of the financial cooperative, but people can invest in the financial cooperative in other ways besides stock ownership. There was a resource about AFSC I saw in the chat that somebody might want to point to about a values-based stock index. And while I'm talking about ownership, should I go ahead and take those other two questions about ownership? Okay. So somebody wanted some distinction between worker-owned co-ops and community-owned co-ops. So cooperatives are made up of people who collectively own a cooperative enterprise, and sometimes they're structured so that the owners are the employees of the business, and sometimes they're structured, in the case of the Renaissance Community Co-op, that's a community-owned co-op, and that means the people who needed that grocery store in their neighborhood, they collectively own that co-op. There's other forms of co-ops, including producer-owned co-ops. A lot of farm co-ops are producer-owned co-ops where those co-ops are built to meet the needs of those farmers, but each farmer continues to own their own farm, but the co-op itself that helps them buy goods for their farms or market their foods, that's collectively owned by those producers. And then there was one other ownership question. Oh, somebody wanted to talk about the difference between ownership and possession. Maybe that's an allusion to some things that are billed as employee owned aren't all that much controlled by the employees. And I'm thinking of many employee stock option plans, not all, but many. And so I mean, the devil's in the details. How do decisions really get made? And in terms of whether ownership is actual or just a thing on a piece of paper.
Great, thanks, Marnie. Yeah, and I see Philip, who is one of the people that asked some of those questions, or didn't ask some of those questions, but making a comment, making the beautiful and true and correct point that we don't own the land owns us. So I think that's really core to this whole conversation, right? How do we return to that as our central operating strategy and principle? I wanted to, I know we're very close to time, but this question of how, there's been such great work done to push our cities to divest from the banks that have been funding the Dakota Access Pipeline and other extractive projects. But we've all had this problem of then where to put these huge amounts of what is, not just capital that can be invested in something like the financial cooperative, but something that has to be able to turn over on a regular basis. And so there's been a lot of chat in the chat box about these questions and folks wanting to build across cities and places to tackle this question. But I'm wondering if one of these panelists, one of our panelists today would just take on that question of, has anyone had the experience of wading through how it is that we find places to put our public monies in, that are large enough to hold them, that meet all the requirements that our cities have, et cetera. And this movement towards creating public banks. Somebody want to raise your hand if you're down to, or Day, maybe you're on mute.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Oh,
Thank
great. Yeah, I couldn't raise my hand because you all can't see me, but I'm happy to start, and then Jamie and others, I'm sure we'll have more to chime in. I mean, I think that is the problem, and also the great opportunity that is all of this energy around divestment with cities and pension funds and other, and other institutional investors starts to gain momentum, whether it's about fossil fuel divestment or about divesting from banks and corporations that are profiting off of incarceration. There's so many, I think, really exciting movements right now that are really taking root and having great impact. But then there's the problem: where do cities put their massive investments? Tiny credit unions like the one I have, it's, we have 50 million in assets. That's puny by financial institution standards, and we can't take municipal deposits in any meaningful way, right? And so where do we go? And that's, I think, the real rationale, and possibly what will be the breakthrough moment for public banking, which people have been thinking about and trying to do for a bunch of years. We have this one example, the State Bank of North Dakota, which is not particularly relevant for everyone across the country working in different contexts. It doesn't always resonate for folks, but there are definitely lessons, I think, to be learned there. There, as far as I think what is happening is that different cities that are pursuing this are in touch, and we're sharing our strategies and what's working and what's not. One thing that we're doing in New York City is we've done research to see what are the public bank-like functions that government already does through different loan programs and so on. So to kind of get rid of this notion that governments shouldn't be involved or don't have the expertise to be involved in this kind of finance. I know someone mentioned in the comments that this is there's centralized control, and that's taking power out of communities. And I think that that's a big question right now for people to tackle, whether public banking is something that's envisioned as individual kind of storefront kind of services, individual facing, or is it a broader kind of infrastructure bank that would support things like the financial cooperative and institutions like community development credit unions, and really, be focused on bigger investments rather than, transactional accounts and services and things like that. And the last point I want to make is that I just think governance and figuring out how these institutions would be structured and governed are the real key questions to make sure that they, fulfill what the promise that people see in them, and they don't just become other kinds of bureaucratic institutions and programs.
Right on. Thank you, Day. Great. And with that, I want to respect folks' time, and the panelists did want to, close out formally this section of the webinar. We're at 1 o'clock. I want to thank people and appreciate folks' time. I also want to say that there's a chat going on with some really rich conversation and questions and folks wanting to connect to each other. So if you can and want to stay for a few minutes, for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, the panelists who can will stay on, and I think we can unmute folks and be able to have a little more conversation. But with that, I'll say thank you to all of our panelists and all of you for joining, and all the incredible, inspiring and transformative work that we're all doing as a part of this movement in this critical moment. Thank you.